Now, a big SD card wallet is great. It'll hold all your SD cards, but if you have multiple little SD card wallets, then you can have your cards specific with each camera and personalized, so you're not guessing which card came out of what camera. So if you want to see how something like this is made, grab some headphones and stick around. Now, I got all this stuff cut out, but I'll still be giving you tips on how to cut it all out. I'll just be using a basic little box cutter you can get at most hardware stores, nothing fancy. And now, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but I got half of the pattern traced onto this. So we're just going to continue on cutting out half of this. So let's go ahead and just take our box cutter. And it's pretty easy since it's just a square. So we'll go ahead and start at the straight edges. And if we hold the knife low, it'll basically ensure that we keep a straight line. And also, always a good idea to protect your workbench with a cut-proof mat or cutting board. So we'll go ahead and get through this side and take off the little nib part and work our way around. And it doesn't have to be perfect, especially if it's cut a little extra, because that's just a little bit we'll sand or even just cut off later. And now for the little pocket, since I cut out a piece that actually had some glue on the top of it, can't use that. I'll use that for the pattern to trace off onto this guy. And make sure you got a nice sharp awl, and just make sure keeping pressure right where you're trying to mark it. And if you keep a good angle, like you don't go straight on, if you angle it like this, it'll make it a lot easier. And sometimes around corners, I'll go from both directions. Makes it a lot more even. And of course the straight line's pretty straightforward. Now it's tricky when you got to switch around. Sometimes I'll switch hands, and that's when little ambidextrous abilities comes into play nicely. But there we go. Now you guys probably won't be able to see that, but can just barely make out that little score line. And continue on cutting it out. And now around corners and bends like this, rather than taking a straight line and going all the way and then coming back and getting the bend, it's better off if you just start from the straight part and then work into the bend, because other times you can just not get the very edge of the bend transition from the straight cut that you might try to make. And then if you hold the knife up at a bit of an angle, that'll let you make the curves nice and easily. And then for the straight sections, you can just lay it down a bit and the knife will cut nice and straight. And that's pretty much cutting out a little pocket. I won't bore you with cutting out the rest of them, so I'll see you in the next step, which is taping. So we'll go ahead and tape up the back of the pattern here just with some clear packing tape, and that way when we let down the leather and put this on to trace off the tooling pattern, this won't get all messed up. It'll stay nice. And then we want to tape the back of this so as we're tooling, it doesn't expand, because it'll basically stretch it out. So this will keep it the size that we need it, and pretty much all we got to do, grab some water. This is just some distilled water. Spray it down, and we'll let that sit a minute or two, and then we can go ahead and trace off the pattern just with a really dull pencil. And not just dull point, but like a rounded point, because we don't want to punch through it or nothing. We just want to transfer the marks. One trick that I heard that I love is if you just hover over the leather and it feels warm, that means that the water is still absorbing into it. When you put your hand over it and it's not noticeably warm, and if you use the back of your hand, it's more sensitive, then that means the water is fully absorbed, then ready to transfer the pattern and carve. So there we go, like 2 minutes, it's absorbed in. good as we need, so we'll just line up the pattern as best as we can. And one thing that's handy is you can get a bag with some leather weight, or you can get a leather bag with some weight in it and put that to hold down your pattern. So now I marked out the stitch line just so we know where not to tool, and then basically we're just gonna run over all these lines again, and this pressure will give us little marks in the leather that we'll be able to see and then cut out with the swivel knife here in a minute. And now a ballpoint pen also works pretty good for this as well. And the handy thing is about using that or a pencil is you can see which lines you've done. I've often done this with just an awl with a really rounded point, but then sometimes you got to keep lifting up the pattern and see how far along you are and which spots you haven't got yet. So this you already know. And then there we go. Now you guys probably won't be able to see that, but I can just make out those lines faintly. So let's grab our swivel knife. Now the one thing here from the pattern is you'll notice that some of these lines connect at points and some of them don't, like on these petals here. I have the points not connecting, but on these other parts they are connecting. But on all the points everywhere, you want to make sure that you don't cut the points actually. You want to leave a little gap and then you'll connect those points when you come back and do your beveling. Like you see here with this petal, I'm not going to go right to the other line. I'm going to give it a little bit of a gap so that way over time the leather won't pull up right there, and then we'll just fill in that gap when we come back and do our beveling. And there we go, not too bad. I would have liked to clean that up a little bit, but that'll come out a little bit when we come back and do beveling. So now we're going to start off with tooling here. And when I first got started, it was always tricky figuring out which side of the line you go to. But if you just go to any one line, if you just pick an end, one end you see meets into another line. But if we start here, and we know that we want to bring out this leaf, so we can go ahead and push down this side here. And same thing again with this guy. And continue on. Now we'll flip it around and we can see that we got a line meeting there and this line meeting here, and we want to bring out this petal. Start from here. We know which side we need to go on to bring out the petal that we desire. So we go back to the other side and we'll just follow that through. And you see, like, here's where I don't cut all the way to the line. I now do that with the beveling. So it doesn't look any different, except for in 10 years if you have a piece that starts peeling off because you cut the entire thing to a point. And when you can, it's always best to try to get as many lines as you can with the tool in the position you're in, rather than flipping the piece around to get every spot in a chronological order. And here again, so like this is a little confusing. You know, you're going over this one, you're not sure, go to the other line, and then that'll tell you which way you want to go. Now here's a real tricky one because it's off the edge, but we can see just a bit which side we got to go of, which is actually going to make the outline of the leaf. And now we'll see if we can fix up this curve here in the beveling. So we're just kind of going to push in a little more there. And look at that, straightens right on out. And so here's when it's kind of confusing, meets into this line, meets into here. But we know this is our background, we want to bring out this vine here. So go ahead and bevel it out. Okay, and there's pretty much one more to bevel and we're done. Done. Alrighty, so let's do some shading. I just got a small little thumbprint here and use our weight bag to help hold this down, keep it in place. And we'll just start shading in these flowers, just following right along the edge there. And then kind of something like that. And now to help guide me along, most of the time I'm using my my pinky here and my ring finger to basically push my thumb and index with the tool. So I'm kind of doing like this type of motion, and that's what's allowing me to get the fine control to follow along this edge here and get these coming out looking all right. So just keep tapping along. Tappity tap tap. Well, this one's pretty tricky because the flower's cutting into it, but we'll get a little more something with the decorative cuts to make it stand out. Alright, so there's pretty much the shading. Let's go on to the next deal, which is going to be putting all the seeds in here. So I'll just start on the outside of this line here and try to space these out as consistently even as possible, while also keeping it in line with the radius of this little seed pod here. And then when you get to the rows where you can't do a full one, I just kind of angle it and we get a little partial impression. Just gets enough of the effect. And then we'll go ahead and vein the stem of this flower. We can get two more. There we go. Oh, bring these out a touch more. There we go. And then we pop a seed right here. Well, between the cameras and the hot lights, a couple things I missed that I need to clean up. One of them is being this pedal right here that got a little choppy, and also I didn't go all the way to the ends with the beveling. So I'll just come back and finish that up before we move on to the next step, and can't really do those no more. So no big deal, just gotta do it before I totally forget. Also, just going over these lines again is going to be better, make them a little bit darker. It does take a little bit more time though. Now let's go ahead and smooth out this guy. Much better. there's kind of how beveling can go a little sideways on you. But we can pretty much clean that up, actually. But definitely a mistake. Alright, so the actual last thing we got to do is put in the finish cuts. So now, the thing with finish cuts is you start at the beginning with the knife going pretty much the full depth that you want. Not all the way through the leather, but like halfway to 2/3 of the way through. And then as you get to the end of where you want your line, you thin it out, so then it just fades off into nothingness pretty much. And now finish cuts are something that are very, well, it's like a signature. Everyone's got their own flavor and taste for them. So I can't really tell you where to put your finish cuts. And, you know, it's really just all about the flow, maintaining it and highlighting it. So you always pretty much just want to literally go with the flow. Alright, and there we go. Now, that is actually the tooling done. Now, if you were going to put some kind of a colored finish like antique or dye, this is where you do that. But since I'm just going to put on some oil and a clear coat, I'm going to move on to gluing and sewing. So we'll go ahead and take off the tape here and move on to getting it glued up for stitching. So now the first part of this is we got to get these pockets ready to glue, because if we just glue them right like this without roughing up the surface here, the glue isn't going to bond well and adhere, and it's just going to pull right away. So these pockets that are going to have pockets on top of them, we need to take a sharp scratch awl, and we're going to basically put our pocket where it's going to be and make sure that we're not going to scratch any higher than like right here. And now you can measure this out how far you need to go, but I just pretty much know by heart how far I need for the stitching, and usually it's about like 1/8 of an inch, 3/16, so a little more doesn't hurt either. It won't really cause that big of a deal, but around there. And so we just keep scratching along, and this will really make sure that the glue will hold up for decades to come and doesn't debond from each other. Because I see other times people will just scratch it up with a knife or a bit of sandpaper, and it works for a while, but if you really hard use the gear, those edges can delaminate over decades. So this just ensures a lot more hard use life out of it, hopefully. Does take a little bit of extra effort and time though, but I think it's worth it. And I kind of go in a crosshatch pattern, make sure a lot of surface area there for the glue. So there's one, and on to the next one. And definitely if you have a nice sharp scratch awl, that will make this go by just a little bit easier and faster. There we go. Now last thing we got to do is go ahead and burnish the tops of all these pockets before we sew it together. So rather than using an edge beveler, I'm just going to sand the corners since this leather is so thin. This is like a 2-3 ounce, and an edge beveler just not working out too well. But a little bit of sanding here, do the job perfectly. And then for actually slicking it, I use a little piece of denim, and then some saddle soap is the secret ingredient. So grab a little bit of that, give it a bit of water, And use a little bit of saddle soap on some denim here, and that's what I'll use to burnish these pockets here. Works a lot better than the slick and stick for this small of leather. And there we go. So now we're pretty much ready to glue these up. So now we'll go ahead and break out the barge glue here, and always got to have some pliers handy. And now when doing little edges like this, you always want to make sure that you're pulling the brush off the edge of the project, otherwise you can get glue built up along the edge. Now to make sure we don't go too far with the glue, I'll just mark out how high up these pockets go, and that way we don't over glue. So now, how I've been lining these up is I'll use my thumb as a backstop and put a piece against there, and then just line up the one corner I can see, hope and pray a little bit, let it down, then just kind of work out where the other side needs to go, and then we put on the other pocket and do roughly the same thing. And then, to seal the deal, hammer it home. And now this glue is somewhat pressure activated, so hammering it like that is going to make it really stick good. So now that this dried a little bit, we're going to go ahead and even out the edges. Now a lot of people will just go ahead and sand this, but with big pieces like this that actually is a substantial amount you got to take off, a good sharp knife does the trick nicely, and no dust to deal with. And then finish up with a bit of sanding with some coarse grit and then some fine grit. Alright, now that those are evened out, we can go ahead and lay out the stitching. Now usually I use about a 3/16 stitching line. That gets me about what I want. I think 1/8 inch is a little too close to the edge for my taste. Now make sure we only mark up to the pockets where we need to, but then this is one of the easy parts. We can just mark this out. Now we're ready for stitching. I got all the holes marked out with my dividers, so let's go ahead and weave these needles. Now, one trick I love for hand stitching is with your awl having a flat spot on it at the correct angle, so no matter which way you flip it, as long as you have that flat spot either on aligned with the top of the piece or at the bottom, the needle will always be at the correct angle. Love that trick. Well, last stitch here and then just one back stitch, and that should be enough to hold this guy for decades to come. Could have done that in focus. Well, now I think we can go ahead and get this guy ready for edge burnishing. So first thing is I'll take a number 1 edger and just pop off the corners, and then we'll do a bit of sanding. So now that I beveled the edges and did a bit of sanding, the first thing I like to do is to go ahead and take a sponge and a bit of water and firstly use this to help lay down the edges preliminary, and then I'll go back with whatever's needed. I have a couple different tricks that I'll use depending on how stubborn the leather wants to be. And like this stuff, already I can tell it's not as firm of a piece of leather, so I'm going to have to pull out some tricks. Well, it got pretty far with the wet burnish, but there's still some areas that you can feel a little bit, and you can hear it's still rough. So the next thing I would try is doing some saddle soap. Now this will really lubricate and get those fibers slicked down good. And now I like it better if the edge of the leather is already wet, and then I'll go ahead and take a bit of saddle soap on my finger and just use that to rub on here. Otherwise, if you put it on the sponge, you're liable to get it off the edge, and the saddle soap is more likely to stain rather than plain water. So now, just in a few seconds like that, you can already feel that the edge is pretty much ready to go now. It's pretty much like magic, so it's definitely the secret sauce if you ask me. And then if there's some edges that still, no matter what you do, you can always come back with a bit of sandpaper and get that straightened out, and then add a bit of water back and some saddle soap, and should get glassy smooth in no time. With enough work, of course. Well, after that, that's pretty good, but you can still see it's just a little bit dull. It's not as shiny as I'd like it to be. So the final thing that I'll put on it is a bit of wax. Now this is a really hard wax. It's one of the hardest waxes in the world, apparently. It's just some shoe polish wax, basically. But this will really seal the edge to help keep the fibers from coming up over time. And it's also going to give a really glassy shine to it. Now you can also use beeswax as well. That's what I used to use before this. Now, one thing I should have done right after stitching was hammer down the thread so that way it's not protruding out and doesn't get worn down over time, but we can go ahead and do that right now. And I like hammering down the thread rather than cutting a channel for the thread to set into, because if you're cutting a channel, then you're cutting the top grain, which is 80% of leather strength. Well, now we're pretty much ready for the final coat to finish, so I like to put on a coat of oil and a final conditioner. Now the oil, I like to use an airbrush since it's already tooled, so I can make sure I get the oil down into the tooling and not just on the surface. Of course, you can also oil it before you tool it, or you just slather enough oil on there that you don't need to do it with an airbrush. But I like doing it with an airbrush so I can get a nice thin, even layer of a couple coats. Well, so now it's got a nice little bit of color to it, and it's going to be oiled up, last a long time. Next thing is I'll just put a top coat conditioner on it, and this is just a leather conditioner with a bit of added wax in there. And now with tooling, I can't just go and slather it on there or else you'll get it in all of the cracks of the tooling. So what I do is put it on a paper towel and make sure I have no blobs on there. It's just kind of soaked in, and then we can go ahead and apply that to our piece without getting it all globbed up down in the tooling, because then it'll just leave little spots with the wax hardened up in there over time. And then after this dries, we can buff it to a real nice shine. Let that sit, and then we'll buff it. Then we'll just buff it with a natural hair brush, get a nice shine going. And there we go. So now, fun part, we can go ahead and expand the pockets with a bone folder here and put in our SD cards. See how well they fit? And look at that, almost like it was made to fit. It's really nice. Now this project turned out pretty good. I'm a little bit unhappy with this tooling line here, and also I had to use some pockets that weren't the best, so I think I'm just going to keep this one for myself. But really nice, going to keep my SD cards organized for many years to come and look great while doing it. So thank you guys for sticking around. Hopefully you enjoyed this project, and I'll see you in the next one.